The air at Patriots' Rest Military Cemetery was still, heavy with reverence and humidity, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Spanish moss swayed gently from the oaks that lined the perimeter, their branches casting long shadows over rows of marble headstones etched with sacrifice. On this solemn morning in Charleston, South Carolina, America was preparing to say goodbye to one of its own Lieutenant Jada Clark, Naval Intelligence Officer, daughter of valor, fallen in service. A hush swept across the gathered crowd, admirals in full regalia, weary veterans in worn uniforms, family members wrapped in grief, and camera crews standing respectfully at a distance. The weight of collective mourning settled over them like a shroud. At the center of it all stood Rear Admiral Nadine Clark, the highest-ranking black woman in the U.S. Navy, her posture impossibly straight, her navy blue dress uniform immaculate, her chest adorned with medals and service ribbons that gleamed in the southern light. But no shine could compete with the stillness in her eyes, a mother burying her only child. The ceremony had begun with military precision. A 7-gun salute cracked through the silence, each shot echoing like thunder across hallowed ground. The honor guard moved with synchronized solemnity. A chaplain's voice offered comfort and scripture. And now, as the casket was lowered into the earth, an honor guard sailor stepped forward to present the folded flag to Admiral Clark. His hands trembled slightly as he held it out. She reached for it slowly, deliberately, with fingers that had once saluted foreign dignitaries and comforted sailors dying in distant seas. The moment, captured live on national television, felt sacred, and then it shattered. A sharp, commanding voice pierced the quiet, like a blade. "Ma'am, drop the flag, and put your hands where I can see them now." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Heads turned. Confusion spread like wildfire. Sergeant Mitchell Crane, Charleston Police Department, approached from the left flank of the ceremony, breaking the sanctity of the funeral with pounding boots and trembling rage. He was white, stocky, buzz-cut, eyes burning with self-importance and something far more dangerous, entitlement. His service weapon was already drawn, pointed directly at Admiral Clark's chest, as he stormed into the center of the funeral. "This woman is impersonating a U.S. officer," he bellowed, voice shrill, eyes twitching as he swept the crowd for support. "This is a fraud. She stole that uniform and those medals. Everyone stand back." Stunned silence turned into shocked murmuring. Mourners recoiled. Cameras zoomed in. News anchors fell silent mid-sentence. The live feed didn't cut away. It couldn't. This wasn't just breaking news. It was breaking history. Admiral Clark didn't move. She simply blinked, long and slow, like someone waking from a nightmare she had known was always waiting. She remained seated at the edge of her daughter's grave, the folded flag still clutched tightly in both hands. Her voice, when it came, was low but firm, forged in steel. "Sergeant, stand down. I am Rear Admiral Nadine Clark, serial number 8479A, United States Navy. You are interrupting a military funeral. You expect me to believe that Crane scoffed. You think just anyone can dress like that and parade around like they earned it?" "Not today." "Exactly," Nadine replied. "Not today." Crane advanced, his weapon now shaking slightly as it hovered near her temple. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his voice rising. "Get on the ground, I won't tell you again." 20 uniformed officers flanked the ceremony. None moved. Some looked away, Others locked eyes with each other in disbelief. One officer had tears streaming down her cheeks. A white veteran near the front whispered, "My God, she's the real deal. That's Admiral Clark." But Crane didn't care. Or maybe he did, and that's why he acted. Maybe her presence, her composure, her existence was too much for him to bear. Maybe this was never about protocol. Maybe it was about power. Admiral Clark slowly stood, not dropping the flag, not raising her hands. She did not plead. She did not run. She stood the way she'd always stood, on principle. You are desecrating sacred ground. You are threatening a flag presented in honor of my daughter's sacrifice. I will not comply with racism masquerading as authority. Cameras caught everything. The angle, the lighting, the blood-red fury in Crane's face as he shoved his gun against her temple, the sudden smear of blood where the gun sight scraped her brow. The sharp cry of Amira Clark Nadine's sister screaming from the front row. She's unarmed. This is murder. And then a gunshot. A single. Ear-splitting crack tore through the air. Screams erupted. A veteran dove for cover. The honor guard fell into formation defensively. For one suspended second. No one could tell who had fired. Nadine was still standing, but Sergeant Crane had stumbled back. Eyes wide, weapon still raised. Behind him, Officer Lena Martinez, his assigned partner, stood frozen, her gun raised but pointed skyward. She had fired into the air. He said she was armed, she cried, but her voice faltered. Crane lunged again, this time tackling Nadine to the ground. The folded flag dropped, crumpling into the grass like something dying. Cameras zoomed in on the surreal image, a U.S. Rear Admiral in full dress uniform, face pinned to the dirt beside her daughter's open grave. Hands wrenched behind her back, wrists cuffed with zip ties, while a white police officer knelt on her spine. Rear Admiral Nadine Clark, you're under arrest for impersonation of an officer, obstruction, and resisting a lawful command. Crane snarled. The absurdity stunned the world. Dozens of mourners screamed in protest. Uniformed military officers surged forward, only to be held back at gunpoint by other local police. Stand down, or you'll be charged. "Two," one officer shouted. "She's real. That's Admiral Clark," a retired Navy SEAL bellowed, pushing through the crowd. "You're making a mistake that's gonna bury this city." But the damage was done, as Clark was dragged from her daughter's funeral. Her medals torn, her dignity assaulted, and her grief weaponized before a nation. The camera feeds remained live. The world watched. The silence that followed the chaos was more damning than any siren. The nation had just witnessed something unthinkable. A mother mourning her fallen daughter, arrested at the grave by a man who saw her uniform and couldn't believe it belonged to her, her blackness, her gender, her medals all too much for a system that had never wanted her in its ranks. In the final shot of the live broadcast, a news drone pulled wide, capturing the scattered funeral, mourners in shock, the flag trampled in the grass, and Admiral Clark, shoved into the back of a cruiser, her eyes never leaving the grave of her daughter. This was no longer just a funeral. It was a spark. A reckoning had begun. 3 days before the gunfire would echo across Patriots' Rest Cemetery, before the cameras would capture an admiral in handcuffs at her own daughter's funeral, Rear Admiral Nadine Clark sat silently by the window of a descending aircraft, her back impossibly straight despite the unbearable weight pressing down on her chest. The military plane from Washington had been quiet for most of the flight. The crew, aware of her circumstances, had kept their distance, offering her space, but also reverence. Nadine, a symbol of resilience in uniform, stared out at the Charleston coastline, the city of her birth now blurred by altitude and grief. Somewhere below, her daughter's casket waited, draped in the same flag Nadine had carried through war zones, into combat strategy rooms across continents. But no battlefield had prepared her for this. Her only child, Lieutenant Jada Clark, had died under unspecified circumstances during an intelligence operation off the Horn of Africa. Officially, it was classified privately. Something gnawed at Nadine's instincts, something about the timing, the tone of the call, the vagueness of the report. Charleston's airport was humid and oddly quiet that morning, as if the air itself understood the gravity of what was arriving. As Nadine moved through the terminal, her uniform turned heads not just out of respect, but recognition. She was, after all, one of the most visible black women in military service, often spotlighted in news segments and commemorative ceremonies, but not all eyes offered welcome. As she approached the final security checkpoint for the military liaison exit, a voice barked sharply, "Ma'am, step aside. Random inspection." The voice belonged to Sergeant Mitchell Crane. He stood with a smugness honed over years of unchecked power, the glint of his badge exaggerated by the harsh overhead lights. Nadine turned calmly, producing her Navy ID, military orders, and travel documents. "I'm on official leave, returning for my daughter's funeral," she stated, her voice measured but brittle with grief. Crane barely glanced at the credentials. "This looks off. Too clean. We've had incidents with fake uniforms before. I'll need you to remove your coat and step over here." Passengers nearby slowed their steps, watching the interaction unfold. A young white couple whispered, recognizing her, "Isn't that Admiral Clark?" The woman clutched her toddler a little tighter. "Sergeant," Nadine said, slowly unfastening the top button of her uniform jacket. "I have cleared security at 2 prior installations. My identity is not in question. I'm not removing these medals for your amusement." He leaned in, his voice low, tight with venom. "You people think you can strut around in these get-ups and not be checked. Not today." The line stopped. One TSA agent dropped his coffee. A black woman in line pulled out her phone. The inspection dragged into humiliation. Crane took her military coat and ran it under scanners, pulled at her ribbons with latex gloves, and examined her rank insignia with false skepticism. "Ever think it's strange how quickly some folks climb the ranks these days?" he muttered, holding up her silver star like it was counterfeit jewelry. By the time Vivian Clark, Nadine's older sister, arrived at the terminal, the confrontation was nearing 2 hours. Vivian's presence brought a new kind of gravity, a retired civil rights judge who once presided over federal discrimination cases. Her white curls framed a face lined with wisdom and iron resolve. "If you don't release my sister immediately," she said with lethal calm, "I'll have a court order signed and a civil rights case filed before your next shift ends." Crane's lip curled. "Ma'am, you're interfering with a lawful procedure." "She's a Rear Admiral," Vivian snapped. "You are violating federal law and your oath to uphold it. But keep talking. You're giving me all the evidence I need." He backed off barely, but not before whispering to his radio. "Target confirmed. The admirals arrived." That phrase, "target confirmed," didn't reach Nadine's ears until much later. But it was the moment the wheels began turning faster than she could anticipate. Outside the airport, her nephew Cameron stood by the car, earbuds in, military buzz cut, and tattoos half hidden under his shirt sleeves. A former Army cryptologist turned freelance cybersecurity analyst. He embraced his aunt with wordless understanding. He had lost his cousin too. Jada had been his childhood co-conspirator, his sister in all but blood. As they drove through Charleston's historic district, the past bled into the present. The Clark family was legacy in that town, 3 generations of military service, civil rights advocacy, and community leadership. Their ancestral home in the East Side stood like a monument, brick and oak framed, every hallway echoing with memory. But the house felt cold this time, not just from loss, but from something else, something watching. That night, unable to sleep, Nadine wandered into Jada's childhood bedroom. Her daughter's voice still seemed to live in the walls, her laughter, her ambitions, her questions about the world. On the desk was a locked steel case with a biometric reader. Nadine's thumbprint opened it. Inside, she found a letter. If anything happens to me, read everything in the drive. Trust no one but family. The flash drive was disguised as a metal ribbon bar. Inside her own laptop, it opened a labyrinth. Dozens of files. Folders labeled Centurions, Deployment Manipulation, Internal Affairs Blacklist, Prescott or CPD. Jada had been investigating something enormous and dangerous. The Centurions were a clandestine brotherhood within Charleston law enforcement, composed of high-ranking officers, veterans turned cops, and political insiders. Their stated mission maintaining order. Their real activities, systemic harassment of black officers, targeted deployments of minority military personnel, falsified reports, and coerced resignations. The files included videos of officers laughing about derailing promotions, internal emails with threats, surveillance logs on specific targets, including Jada herself. She was onto something. Nadine whispered. They knew it. Cameron, who had stayed up tracing digital footprints from his own laptop, turned his screen toward her. And they've been watching you too, Aunt Nadine. Your Navy files were accessed last week from a CPD proxy IP address. Someone was digging deep and wiping things. Vivian joined them moments later, reading the letter in silence, her eyes narrowing. This isn't just Charleston. This is systemic, coordinated, and your daughter was in the middle of it. Suddenly, the quiet of the house was broken by a knock. A low, slow knock. At the door stood a young white man in plain clothes, nervous eyes scanning the street. Name's Detective Rory Linwood. I work internal affairs. Quietly. He handed Nadine a sealed envelope. Your daughter reached out to me 6 months ago, told me the Centurions were more than a whisper. She was scared, but determined. Nadine opened the envelope. Inside were redacted personnel records, deployment override requests, and names officers linked to CPD, JROTC programs, local judges, even the office of Senator William Prescott. The Centurions call it correcting the imbalance, Linwood said, his voice low. They think too many black officers in high positions threaten the chain of command. They don't just push people out, they send them into danger, the kind they don't come back from. Nadine stared at her daughter's files, at her legacy, at her sacrifice. They killed her, she whispered. No, Vivian said softly, placing a hand on her sister's shoulder. They tried to silence her, but they forgot whose child she was. The house was no longer cold. It was awake. And the reckoning had already begun. The storm had not yet broken over Charleston, but Admiral Nadine Clark could feel it gathering an invisible pressure in the air, tightening like a vice with each passing hour. In the 2 days since her return, Grief had become a secondary burden. Jada's death no longer felt accidental or even circumstantial. It felt arranged, systematic, intentional, and Nadine, with every fiber of her disciplined being, knew she was standing at the edge of a battle far more insidious than any she had faced across oceans or deserts. This war was on American soil. This enemy wore badges, held office, and operated under the illusion of patriotism. But they were traitors in every uniformed sense of the word. The first break in this gathering silence came the next morning, when a contact of Vivian's arranged a discreet meeting in a parking garage beneath the courthouse. It was there, in the muted hush of concrete pillars and flickering fluorescent lights, that Nadine met Detective Min Alvarez, a slender, sharp-eyed man with the cautious posture of someone who knew too much and trusted too few. He wore a windbreaker over his department-issue holster and kept one hand near it at all times, his other clutching a file that he passed to Nadine the moment they stepped into the shadows. "I was a friend of your daughter's," he said, voice low and steady. "She reached out to me when she started seeing patterns arrests, reassignments, harassment targeting black officers and military vets. At first, I told her it was coincidence. I'd seen racism in the department, sure, but this was different, coordinated, calculated." Nadine opened the file and scanned its contents. Names, photos, maps, correspondence, a web of influence stretching from the Charleston Police Department's Internal Affairs Division all the way up to state-level infrastructure boards and private contractors. But the name that struck like a hammer was bold and unmistakable on several pages: Senator William Prescott. "Your daughter found the link," Alvarez said, nodding. "She traced deployment override requests, dozens of them, to a shell corporation tied to a defense contractor, Southport Dynamics. On paper, they handle equipment supply chains and military logistics consulting. In reality, they facilitate quiet purges. Officers who question the wrong thing get flagged. If they're military, their deployment orders are redirected. Hot zones, they call them, places where accidents happen." Nadine's breath caught. Jada's last deployment had been in a zone barely mentioned in official Navy briefings. A known insurgent corridor, undersupplied and overexposed. At the time, Nadine had chalked it up to bad luck, bad timing. But now she saw it for what it was, a death sentence delivered under the guise of orders. Alvarez continued, "Southport is deeply embedded. Their former VP now sits on the governor's Security Advisory Council. Senator Prescott has approved every one of their defense contracts for the past 7 years. In exchange, they help him clean house quietly. Black officers, whistleblowers, reformists, all marked. Some disappear. Some, like your daughter, don't come home." A silence stretched between them, thick and grave. Then Alvarez pulled out a USB drive from his coat pocket. "This has everything Jada sent me. Surveillance logs, secret recordings, meeting minutes, even video from a hidden mic she wore during a confrontation with a Southport executive. It's damning, enough to bury them." "But if it's so damning," Nadine asked, eyes narrowing, "why hasn't anything happened?" He exhaled slowly. "Because no one wants this fight. I tried to go up the chain. My report disappeared. My supervisor warned me to drop it. Then my apartment got broken into. The message was clear. They're watching everyone." Indeed, that warning had already come for Nadine. That evening, back at the Clark family home, a soft rustling outside her window prompted Cameron to check the perimeter. What he found was not a prowler, but a tiny surveillance device nestled in the flower bed beneath the front porch light, a military-grade mic disguised as a stone. It wasn't the first. 3 more were found tucked near window frames and inside a vent in Jada's old room. Someone had bugged the home, likely weeks ago, likely before Jada had even died. Worse came the next morning. Nadine awoke to dozens of missed calls and urgent texts. Her name was trending online, but not for the reasons it should have been. Admiral under scrutiny. One headline read, "Security clearance reviewed amidst suspicion." A popular conservative blogger had posted an anonymous letter claiming Nadine had lied on her service evaluations, citing mental instability and anti-American sympathies. The blog post linked to grainy images doctored showing Nadine at anti-military protests that had never happened. Her official Navy file had been leaked but altered. Her deployments twisted. Her commendations questioned. It was a digital smear campaign, and it was surgical in its precision. Southport has a cyber warfare division, Cameron said, eyes wide as he tapped through lines of code and metadata. I traced this upload back to a subdomain they registered 2 months ago. This wasn't retaliation. This was planned. They knew they'd be coming for you next, and the smear was working. By midday, Nadine received a formal notification her top-secret security clearance was placed under review, pending internal investigation. The timing was obvious. If she lost that clearance, her ability to pursue Jada's case through military channels would evaporate. Her access to the Pentagon, gone. Her reputation, destroyed. Vivian, reading the notice with a trembling jaw, hissed through her teeth. They're trying to erase you before you can speak. Classic playbook. Discredit. Dismantle. Disappear. But Nadine wasn't built for silence. She had withstood combat. Sexism. Racism. Decades of being underestimated. Now they were targeting her the way they had targeted her daughter. And something inside her had shifted. That evening, the Clark house became a war room. Vivian placed calls to old legal contacts. Cameron secured off-grid storage for the files. And Alvarez agreed to arrange covert meetings with trusted allies inside the department and the military. But even as they worked, Nadine felt the noose tightening. That night, a car with government plates parked across the street from the house and didn't leave until 4 a.m. At 2:17, the family's Wi-Fi went down. At 3:12, the backup generator kicked in. Someone had tampered with the power. Still, Nadine did not flinch. Instead, she gathered her daughter's files, her own record of service, and the recordings Alvarez had provided. She opened a fresh manila folder. On the cover, in neat black ink, she wrote one word, justice. This was no longer a quiet investigation. It was a declaration of war. And Admiral Nadine Clark was just getting started. The day of Lieutenant Jada Clark's funeral dawned beneath a slate-gray Charleston sky, heavy with a kind of stillness that felt rehearsed, deliberate, as if the heavens themselves were waiting to see what kind of injustice would unfold beneath them. Patriots Rest Military Cemetery had never seen a ceremony like this. Hundreds gathered fellow service members in dress blues, veterans with gleaming medals on their chests, grieving civilians wrapped in black, reporters quietly adjusting camera tripods, and city officials, some out of respect, others out of calculation. Yet, even before the first hymn, Rear Admiral Nadine Clark could sense the distortion. It wasn't just the extra metal barricades or the heavily armed officers stationed in every visible corner. It was the orchestration of it all. A funeral that should have been sacred ground for mourning had been turned into a chessboard. As Nadine stepped from the black government SUV, her spine unbent by the weight of grief or surveillance, her appearance drew a collective hush. Her dress uniform bore every star, bar, and commendation she'd earned through 3 decades of service. Her face was unreadable. Only her eyes betrayed the storm beneath eyes that had wept in silence for Jada every night since the news came. But now held nothing but resolve. She was not just a mother burying her child. She was a sentinel at the edge of war. Immediately, the tension tightened. A pair of local officers approached her before she even reached the ceremonial path. One requested identification again. Despite her formal role in the ceremony, the other inspected the guest list like a customs agent rifling through a stranger's luggage. "This is standard protocol." "Ma'am," the first officer said, refusing to meet her gaze. "Since when do Gold Star mothers need clearance for their own child's burial?" Nadine asked, her voice precise, cutting through the air like a blade. The officers didn't respond, but the message was clear. "You are not welcome here." Not like that. The funeral program, pre-approved weeks prior, had been mysteriously altered. Jada's unit, composed of diverse, highly decorated young officers, had been reassigned to the rear of the procession, while white officers from Charleston's police department were seated at the front. "VIP guests," the cemetery director claimed. The front section, nearest the burial site, was cordoned off by barriers only select individuals were allowed to cross. When members of Jada's Navy team, 2 black women and a Latino man, attempted to join the front row with Nadine, they were stopped. "Restricted access," muttered a sergeant from the Charleston PD. "To a funeral?" Lieutenant Soraya Lee asked, eyes narrowing. "She died serving this country." "What the hell is this?" Nadine intervened, placing a calming hand on Soraya's shoulder. "Let them play their game. They want a reaction. We won't give it yet." The media presence had tripled overnight. Drones hovered overhead like vultures, their lenses trained on Nadine. Cameramen adjusted focus whenever she moved. No one was filming the stone-faced officers who monitored mourners with military-grade binoculars. No one documented how black guests were pulled aside for extra screening while white attendees breezed through. The performance of law and order was in full costume, and Nadine was their intended stage prop. By the time the funeral began, the air was brittle with unease. The chaplain, visibly shaken, stammered through the opening prayer. Each word felt like a stone dragged across sandpaper. The honor guard proceeded with dignity despite the tension, rifles gleaming in the overcast light. But even they could feel the undercurrent like a riptide forming just beneath the surface. A subtle, silent rehearsal for something unspeakable. Nadine stood near her daughter's casket, her sister Vivian beside her, Cameron a few paces back, scanning the perimeter like a sentinel. Jada's framed photo rested on a pedestal beside the casket, her face beaming in full dress uniform, alive, radiant, unbroken. When the moment came for the flag presentation, silence fell like a dropped curtain. The folded flag was handed to Nadine by a sergeant from Jada's team, a young white man who had served alongside her in Bahrain and had refused to stand down when the seating plan was changed. His voice trembled with sorrow. "On behalf of the President of the United States Navy, and a grateful nation." Nadine accepted the flag with grace, cradling it like the final heartbeat of her daughter's life. That was when Sergeant Mitchell Crane struck. He appeared from the side, pushing past the honor guard like a man immune to consequence. "Step away from the general," he shouted, drawing his weapon and aiming it directly at Nadine. Gasps exploded. A baby wailed. Cameras snapped to life. Every lens trained on one image, a white police sergeant with a gun, pointed at a decorated black admiral during her daughter's funeral. "She's armed," Crane bellowed. "She's reaching for a weapon." The accusation was so absurd, so sudden, it seemed to shatter time itself. Nadine, frozen in disbelief, didn't flinch. Her arms were wrapped around a flag. No weapon, no threat, just grief and now, fury. "You are out of line." "Sergeant," she said, voice low and steady. "Stand down, now." But he didn't. Instead, he stepped closer, gun raised to her temple, his eyes wide with something far more unhinged than fear. "You think we don't see what you're doing? Turning this into your platform, stirring trouble. No more," Vivian screamed. "She's unarmed. You bastard! You're on camera." And indeed, they were. Reporters shouted for clarity. One drone zoomed in to an almost cinematic angle. But Crane had crossed the threshold. There was no pulling back. Suddenly, another shot rang out, not from Nadine, not from Crane, but from another officer nearby. A blank into the sky. A distraction. Shouting erupted. "She's going for a weapon," someone screamed. Officers swarmed. Crane tackled Nadine, slamming her into the ground, her flag falling into the dirt beside Jada's coffin. Mud splattered across her medals. The woman who had served her nation with unwavering loyalty now lay pinned beneath a knee, hands zip-tied behind her back, while the soil of her daughter's grave stained her uniform. "Rear Admiral Nadine Clark, you are under arrest for attempted assault and failure to comply with law enforcement at a public safety event." Crane barked. The absurdity of the words echoed in the stunned silence that followed. And then the crowd rose. Veterans surged forward, but officers blocked them with rifles raised. Reporters shouted over each other. "This is a violation of civil rights." "We have this on tape." She was unarmed. Cameron was shoved to the ground trying to reach his aunt. Vivian collapsed in shock. But amid the chaos, a booming voice cut through. "What the hell is going on here?" A man in a dark suit pushed through the police line, flanked by agents flashing federal badges. "I'm Special Agent Isaac Monroe with the Department of Justice," he said. Fury etched across his face. "Release the Admiral. Now." Crane refused. "She's our suspect. She'll be processed. You'll be processed," Agent Monroe replied coldly, drawing a letter from his pocket. "We're investigating a civil rights conspiracy tied to CPD and Senator Prescott's office. Any further action against Admiral Clark will be considered obstruction of justice." But the damage had been done. As Nadine was dragged toward a cruiser, face bloodied from gravel, cameras captured every second. The image went viral within hours, an admiral in cuffs beside her child's grave. A mother, a patriot, treated like a criminal in the presence of her dead daughter. And across America, something ignited. This was not just a funeral. It was a flashpoint. The trap had been set, but the nation had seen who stepped into it. And this time, the truth had witnesses. So many witnesses. The world didn't blink, it burned. Within hours of Rear Admiral Nadine Clark's arrest, at her daughter's funeral, the footage had rocketed across every digital platform, network, and device in the country. There she was, blood on her temple, wrists zip-tied behind her back, her face pressed to the dirt beside her child's casket, still in her full dress uniform. The American flag she had just been handed in honor of her daughter's sacrifice now lay trampled and half-buried in the cemetery soil. The image arrested motherhood, dishonored service. Defiance Interrupted seared itself into the nation's conscience like a brand. Outrage erupted in waves. Veterans across the country took to social media with hashtags like #JusticeForAdmiral Clark. Salute Not Silence, and the New Birmingham. Civil rights organizations staged midnight vigils outside Charleston City Hall and the county jail. In Washington, retired generals black, white, Latino, Asian gave back-to-back interviews denouncing the incident as a constitutional disgrace. Bronze Star recipients tweeted their condemnation. Congressional Black Caucus members demanded an emergency hearing. And in cities from Atlanta to Sacramento, thousands marched with signs bearing Nadine's image and the words she served. Now we serve her. The Department of Justice had no choice but to act. By sunrise the next day, Special Agent Elijah Harmon of the FBI's Civil Rights Division was on the ground in Charleston. A towering man with silver in his beard and fire in his eyes, Harmon had built his reputation by taking down police gangs in Los Angeles and exposing cover-ups in St. Louis. He arrived not as a diplomat, but as a scalpel sharp, focused and surgical. His first visit wasn't to City Hall or the courthouse, it was to the county jail, where Rear Admiral Nadine Clark was being held under heightened security for the safety of others. That heightened security was little more than a paper-thin cover for targeted isolation. Upon her arrival at Charleston County Detention Center, Nadine had been denied a phone call, her uniform confiscated, her rank stripped from her name by every guard who addressed her only as Clark. They placed her in solitary pending psychiatric evaluation, claiming her arrest justified concern for her mental stability. The message was clear: you don't belong here, and no one will save you. The cell was cold, deliberately overlit, and reeked of mildew and silence. Meals were irregular. Questions went unanswered. She requested counsel, and the request vanished. She demanded medical attention for the wound on her head. The nurse claimed the log was full. They had no idea they were trying to cage a storm, but inside the walls of that jail. Nadine wasn't alone. Word traveled faster than surveillance. A Latina inmate named Corporal Janice Morales, a former Marine dishonorably discharged under suspicious circumstances after filing harassment claims, recognized Nadine the moment she saw her. "That's the Admiral," she whispered to a bunkmate. They got her too, within hours. A protective network emerged. Women from all branches: Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, many incarcerated over manipulated charges or coerced plea deals. Banded together, they passed notes through meal trays, slipped Nadine socks, clean towels, protein bars. One woman, a former Air Force medic named Simone Tate, offered her makeshift bedding during Nadine's second night in the holding block. "You brought me home once," Simone murmured. "Now it's our turn." Every act of kindness was quiet rebellion. Every moment they protected her was a warning to the system. She is not yours to break. Meanwhile, outside those gray stone walls, the tide of battle shifted. Detective Min Alvarez, sleepless and trembling with urgency, stepped into the FBI's mobile command unit and dropped a single flash drive on the table. "This is everything," he said to Agent Harmon. "Recordings of Centurion meetings, deployment sabotage plans, targeting lists, and conversations that link Prescott and Crane to the whole operation. Your Admiral wasn't arrested. She was neutralized." The recordings were chilling. Voices boomed with laughter as officers joked about sending troublemakers to sandboxes, bragged about cooking the numbers to keep white officers in power, and discussed using private contractors to manipulate military orders. One recording captured Senator William Prescott's unmistakable drawl. "The brass are too woke these days. Someone has to remind these rising stars that we still run the foundation." Agent Harmon listened without a word. Then he stood and turned to his team. I want a warrant, drafted within the hour. This isn't just about a funeral. This is a domestic operation designed to undermine military integrity. We're going after their infrastructure. Charleston trembled. Within hours, federal subpoenas were issued. DOJ attorneys filed injunctions to seize Charleston PD records. The Pentagon's Inspector General opened an emergency audit of Southport Dynamics and its connections to military deployments. The NSA confirmed that several of Nadine's communications had been illegally intercepted through a private contractor's network, data traffic rerouted through a ghost server in Alabama, traced back to a Southport-owned IP range. As the investigation expanded, the media narrative, once cautiously balanced, surged behind Admiral Clark. Whistleblowers began to surface like air bubbles rising from a submerged wreck. A former Southport contractor leaked emails showing that Jada Clark had been specifically flagged for internal disruption weeks before her final deployment. A Navy logistics officer came forward to reveal that her transfer orders were altered outside of the standard command chain, even a low-level CPD clerk. Anonymously, but courageously. Released files showing fabricated incident reports used to discredit black officers inside the jail. Nadine remained quiet, biding her time. She knew the system was trying to bury her in silence, but she also knew her silence wasn't a void, it was a weapon. She used it to study, to listen, to build resolve. She watched guards, noted their rotations. She memorized surveillance blind spots and access points. She heard stories from the women who kept her safe, stories of miscarriages ignored, assaults covered up, discharge papers doctored with racist euphemisms. This wasn't a jail. It was a graveyard for black and brown women who had tried to serve their country and were punished for believing they belonged. Then came the shift. On the morning of the third day, the jail's intercom system crackled with unexpected activity. "Inmate Clark," a voice barked. "Prepare for transfer. You're being moved to general population." It was a tactic, an escalation. They believed she had been softened by isolation, that dropping her into the lion's den would finish what they started. But they hadn't counted on the lions already circling for her. As she stepped into the larger block, 30 heads turned, and then, like a wave, they stood. Dozens of women, in orange jumpsuits and scraped knuckles, rose to attention. Some saluted, others just nodded. But the message was unmistakable. You are not alone, Admiral. Not in here. Not ever. Back at FBI headquarters, Agent Harmon's team reviewed the final bombshell, a digital ledger from Southport's internal accounting system showing millions funneled into anonymous PACs. Political action committees connected directly to Prescott's re-election campaign. The Centurions weren't just a rogue brotherhood. They were an instrument of political control. Their job wasn't merely intimidation, it was engineering a racial caste within the military, using loyalty tests, harassment, and bureaucratic sabotage to shape who rose and who disappeared. That afternoon, Agent Harmon stepped onto the steps of the Charleston courthouse with a microphone in one hand and a folder in the other. "We have obtained credible evidence," he said, voice booming, "that multiple government officials, law enforcement personnel, and private contractors engaged in a deliberate conspiracy to target, discredit, and endanger black military personnel. Rear Admiral Nadine Clark was arrested under false pretenses in an effort to silence a family that got too close to the truth." Cheers erupted. Reporters swarmed. The public had their confirmation. And Nadine, still in custody but no longer unseen, had become a living symbol of what America could no longer afford to ignore. Justice, once slow and elusive, was now sprinting toward the gates. But Nadine Clark didn't celebrate. Not yet. Because she knew the Centurions had more to lose, and men like William Prescott would not go down without a war. The world had watched Rear Admiral Nadine Clark be arrested in disgrace. But they were about to witness her rise with purpose. Once released from jail under direct federal order, Nadine did not rest, did not retreat, did not allow herself the indulgence of reflection. She had been bruised, shackled, and publicly humiliated, but not broken. Her grief had sharpened into precision, and now, with the backing of a nation that had seen its own rot exposed in the face of a mother's suffering, she began to move not as a victim, but as a strategist. The first meeting of the coalition that would bring down the Centurions took place in a secure facility on the outskirts of Charleston. A decommissioned Navy warehouse turned into an impromptu war room. The long metal table in the center, once used for logistics briefings, now bore laptops, evidence folders, tactical maps, and names like Crane, Bellamy, Prescott, names that would soon either fall or flee. Nadine sat at the head of the table, flanked by her sister, Judge Vivian Clark, who had come out of retirement with the fury of a woman betrayed by a justice system she once tried to uphold. Special Agent Elijah Harmon, now leading a full federal task force with authority that reached from Charleston to Capitol Hill, and a growing cadre of military allies officers, legal experts, and quiet insiders still in uniform, all determined to see the mission through. The room buzzed with tension, strategy, and unflinching purpose. "We need to go surgical," Nadine said, her voice unwavering. "We expose the architecture piece by piece, not just the foot soldiers like Crane, but the architects, the ones pulling the strings behind the podiums. Prescott, Bellamy, Southport Dynamics. We take them down all at once. Or the machine resets." Vivian nodded. "We've got whistleblower protections in motion, but they won't hold if the public attention fades. We need airtight evidence, direct confessions, and the kind of footage that can't be spun." Agent Harmon leaned forward, placing a flash drive on the table. "Alvarez and our tech unit decrypted Jada's last files. There's a pattern communications between Bellamy and Southport execs. Encrypted deployment logs routed through third-party servers. Campaign donations linked to shell companies that lead directly to Prescott's re-election fund. But that's still circumstantial. We need the head of the snake to speak." The room fell quiet. They all knew what that meant. Someone had to get Chief Raymond Bellamy, the charismatic, silver-haired police chief of Charleston, to admit his role in the conspiracy. Bellamy, a man who preached unity on camera while promoting division behind closed doors. He was the public face of reform while privately sanctioning a racial brotherhood within his force, shielding officers like Crane and overseeing illegal data collection on black officers and returning military personnel. "I'll do it," Nadine said. "No," Harmon objected instantly. "He's dangerous. You're too high profile after what happened at the funeral. They'll have eyes on you." "Exactly," Nadine countered. "They think I'm desperate, isolated, tarnished. That makes me useful to Bellamy. He thinks I want to salvage my career. He'll want to leverage that." Vivian frowned, but didn't speak. She knew Nadine too well to argue. When her sister locked eyes like that, her decision had already passed from consideration to execution. It took less than 24 hours to orchestrate the meeting. A request was made through a quiet intermediary, an old colleague of Bellamy's from the Navy Reserve, who now worked in civilian intelligence. The message was simple. Rear Admiral Clark is willing to talk. She wants her clearance restored. She's tired. She's ready to deal. All lies. but lies rooted in truths Bellamy would believe. The meeting was set for a Tuesday afternoon at the Charleston Waterfront Club, an exclusive, oak-paneled institution where the elite of the city whispered secrets over bourbon and lamb chops. Nadine arrived precisely at 3:00 p.m., wearing a civilian blazer and a thin smile. Beneath her collar, inside her lapel, was a pin, an advanced directional mic, wired to a transmitter relaying everything in real time to Harmon's nearby surveillance van. Every syllable, every pause, every damning breath. Bellamy met her with a theatrical smile. "Admiral Clark," he said, standing and offering his hand. "I'm glad you've come to your senses." She shook it, noting how his grip lingered just a moment too long. "I'm glad you agreed to meet." They sat in a corner booth, shielded by high-backed leather and dim lighting. A waiter brought 2 glasses of whiskey, Bellamy's signature order, and withdrew. "You've been through hell," he said, leaning back, tone sympathetic. "I imagine jail was sobering." "I've had better weeks," Nadine replied, playing the role, "but it forced me to reevaluate." He nodded, as if he'd expected this. Sometimes it takes a fall to understand who really runs the battlefield. There it was, the arrogance, the belief that she'd been conquered. She let him continue. "You were always a symbol." Clark, a problem in waiting. Too loud, too proud. The kind of officer that scares the brass, the kind that disrupts the chain of tradition. Nadine took a slow sip of water. "I want to fix this. My clearance, my reputation. I'm willing to listen." Bellamy grinned. "Victorious. Good. Because the people I work with, they believe in order, not chaos. They're not racist. Nadine, they're realists. They understand the military was never meant to be a social experiment. It's about control, stability, heritage." She didn't speak. She let the silence urge him on. "The Centurions," he said casually, as if naming a book club. "They are a fail-safe, a tradition of guardianship. We identify threats disruptors like your daughter, and we neutralize them before they infect the ranks." Nadine's fingers clenched beneath the table. "She was smart," Bellamy said, almost admiringly. "Too smart. She found the pattern. But patterns are dangerous. She could have become a symbol. So, we made sure her deployment placed her elsewhere. Senator Prescott called it administrative redirection. Effective, painless, tragic." "Really? Did he sign the orders himself?" Nadine asked softly. "No. That's the beauty of it. Layers of deniability. But the Centurions know, and they take care of their own. That includes you, if you play this right." Nadine stood. "I think I've heard enough." Bellamy blinked. "Excuse me, not everything I've done in uniform involved weapons," she said, tapping her lapel. "Sometimes intelligence is louder than artillery." Outside, the FBI team was already moving. Agents swarmed the club's entrance as Harmon, now holding a live transcript and recording, read Bellamy his rights. He went pale, then red, then quiet. Back in the war room, Nadine removed the wire and looked toward the screen, where live feeds now showed officers being arrested across the city: Centurions, Southport executives, even a stunned city councilman in handcuffs. Vivian smiled grimly. "Now we bury the architects." But Nadine's eyes were not on the screen. They were on the empty chair beside her, where Jada would have sat. "Not just justice," she whispered. "Restoration." The task force moved into its final phase. The battle had begun in silence. Now it roared with clarity. The storm broke before sunrise. In the pre-dawn hours of a humid Charleston morning, as dew clung to blades of grass, and the city's crooked streets still slept beneath the weight of history. The gates of impunity were torn open. Coordinated federal raids, planned with military precision and timed to the second, swept across the city and beyond like a rising tide. Black SUVs rolled through police precinct parking lots. Tactical teams in unmarked gear moved with eerie silence. Helicopters circled overhead, their floodlights piercing the dark. At 4:17 a.m., Chief Raymond Bellamy was taken from his home in handcuffs. The once revered, media-savvy patriarch of the Charleston Police Department, a man who built his career on the illusion of fairness, was led down his own front steps, barefoot and stunned, as his neighbors watched from behind curtains and news cameras captured the image for a nation that would not forget it. Across the city, Sergeant Mitchell Crane, the man who had pressed a pistol to Rear Admiral Nadine Clark's temple in front of her daughter's coffin, was pulled from his bed with force. When he attempted to reach for a weapon, always the last refuge of cowards, he was tackled by two federal agents who had already anticipated his move. His arrest was not quiet, nor was it dignified, nor did it deserve to be. But Charleston was only the beginning. The Centurions, once a whisper network embedded in the marrow of local institutions, were exposed as a vast, interlocking conspiracy. Dozens of officers, contractors, city administrators, and federal liaisons were indicted within 72 hours. Bank accounts were frozen, evidence servers seized. Careers ended in a single press conference when Special Agent Elijah Harmon, standing before a crowd of national journalists in Washington, held up a series of signed documents. "These," he said, "are deployment order overrides, authorized not through military channels but through Southport Dynamics, at the instruction of Senator William Prescott." A silence fell across the press corps. Prescott's name was not new to scandal, but the gravity of this was unprecedented. Not corruption for profit, not mere abuse of power, but deliberate, racially motivated sabotage of black service members. Prescott had orchestrated military deployments to hostile territories, death by spreadsheet, aimed at silencing whistleblowers and derailing rising officers who didn't fit the mold of traditional command. The senator tried to deny it. Of course, he went on cable news, voice trembling with feigned indignation, claiming it was all politically motivated. But the receipts were too many, the emails too damning, the voices on the wiretap unmistakable, and when confronted with the recording of his conversation with Bellamy, the one where he referred to Jada Clark as a ticking diversity time bomb, even his allies in the Senate turned their backs. A day later, facing expulsion and a federal indictment, he resigned from office, his final press conference drowned out by protesters chanting Jada's name in unison. And through it all, Nadine Clark did not blink. When her reinstatement letter arrived from the Pentagon, signed by the Secretary of the Navy with a handwritten note of apology, she read it once and tucked it away without ceremony. The medals returned to her uniform were polished and positioned exactly as before. But they no longer felt like decoration. They felt like testimony of survival, of vindication, of truth wrestled from a nation too often comfortable with forgetting. She did not smile when the president called. She accepted the apology with grace. She declined a private ceremony. "Finish the funeral," she said. "That's all I want." And so they did. On a warm morning beneath a blue Virginia sky, Arlington National Cemetery opened its gates for Lieutenant Jada Clark once more. This time, there were no barricades, no weapons, no false security checkpoints. This time, The path to her grave was lined with white-gloved sailors and Marines who stood at perfect attention. Thousands came soldiers, civilians, Gold Star families, and activists who had marched when Nadine was still in chains. The president stood beside her, as did the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Agent Harmon was there too, dressed not in his usual suit, but in a navy blue tie pinned with a single star. Vivian held Nadine's hand throughout, her eyes glistening, her back straight as a judge's gavel. Jada's casket was redraped with a new flag crisp, untouched, folded by the same hands who once served beside her. This time, the flag did not fall to the ground. This time, it was placed gently into Nadine's arms, as a lone bugler played taps with such aching clarity that even the doves on the marble columns seemed to pause their wings. Then came the announcement, the one Nadine had not requested, but had earned. The president approached the podium and, with the weight of a humbled nation in his voice, signed into law the Jada Clark Military Justice Act. The legislation created new protections for service members against race-based deployments, whistleblower retaliation, and discriminatory career sabotage. It mandated transparent oversight of all deployment orders involving personnel flagged for complaints or retaliation. It established a civilian review board with military expertise, empowered to audit and investigate without command interference. Jada's name would live not just in memory, but in policy. As the ink dried, veterans in the crowd saluted. Nadine stood tall, the flag folded against her heart. But her journey was not over. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effect spread. Southport Dynamics was dismantled. Several executives were indicted on federal conspiracy charges. An internal review revealed their contractors had been embedded in no fewer than 6 other cities' military liaison offices. Investigations opened across Texas, Florida, Missouri. Officers once protected by the Centurions began flipping turning states' evidence in exchange for reduced sentences. And everywhere, the same story emerged: black officers harassed, career blocked, and sometimes reassigned to deployments with little explanation and even less protection. The story spread beyond military circles. Talk shows, podcasts, and evening news specials ran hour-long retrospectives. The Clark Files, the Centurion Conspiracy, the funeral that sparked a movement. Civil rights organizations launched new initiatives. Faith leaders preached her name from pulpits. Parents named their daughters after Jada. And across military bases, young black service members stood a little taller, a little prouder, knowing someone had stared down the system and won. Nadine turned down every book deal, every documentary contract, every honorary degree. Her voice wasn't for sale, but she did agree to one interview, a live town hall broadcast from Charleston, where she stood in front of the building that once held her in a jail cell and said, "I didn't set out to make history. I set out to bury my child. But when the soil was poisoned, I had to dig deeper. And what we found there was a cancer that stretches further than any of us could have imagined. This isn't about me. It's about the families whose children never came home. It's about the quiet rot we overlook in the name of tradition. It's about the kind of country we still have the chance to become if we're brave enough to look the truth in the eye and refuse to flinch." Thunderous applause followed, but Nadine, as always, remained composed, and when the broadcast ended, she walked quietly to her car, alone. That night, as the moon rose over the Clark family home in Charleston, Nadine stepped into Jada's old room. It was exactly as she had left it. The books on the shelf, the half-written notes, the naval maps on the wall. She sat on the edge of the bed and unfolded a letter she had found weeks before, tucked inside Jada's favorite novel. Mom, if you're reading this, I probably went poking too deep. But don't worry, I got that from you. I just hope you'll keep digging after me, because I believe if anyone can shine a light on the truth, it's you. Nadine smiled through her tears. Outside, in the distance, church bells rang, and somewhere beyond the veil, her daughter's voice echoed back. Mission complete. The tide had turned, not with a roar, but with quiet resolve, reshaping the nation's conscience and carving a path through centuries of silence. The name Nadine Clark, once whispered through chains of command with admiration and skepticism alike, now stood inscribed in the architecture of justice itself. What had begun as a mother's mourning had become a movement. What was once grief now bore the weight and the promise of legacy. In the months following the signing of the Jada Clark Military Justice Act, the transformation within the armed forces and across federal institutions was not just procedural, it was cultural. Command structures once shrouded in unaccountable privilege had been pierced by accountability. Oversight boards formed, deployment patterns reviewed. Command decisions, once unquestioned, now required explanation, transparency, and ethical vetting. And leading that charge, appointed by unanimous vote from the Joint Chiefs and with full endorsement from the Secretary of Defense, was a woman who had never asked for glory. Only truth. Vice Admiral Nadine Clark, the third black woman in history to achieve 3-star rank in the Navy. The first to do so with a ribbon bearing the Presidential Medal of Civil Honor pinned alongside the Defense Distinguished Service Medal. The appointment came with more than rank. It came with a mandate she would serve as chair of the newly formed Defense Equity Commission, a permanent, independent body charged with monitoring equity, justice, and retaliation within the armed forces. The Commission's headquarters would be housed in a repurposed training center in Washington, D.C., its walls now lined not with medals and portraits, but with photographs of those whose careers had been cut short by bias, betrayal, and silence. At the center of its main hallway hung a simple black and white photo Lieutenant Jada Clark, saluting her unit, her eyes bright with vision. But Nadine's greatest act was not in the chambers of power. It was not during hearings or briefings. It happened, instead, on a cool spring afternoon in Charleston, where the community gathered beneath flapping banners and brilliant sun to dedicate a new national foundation, the Jada Clark Initiative. Born from tragedy, shaped by integrity, and funded through donations from veterans, private donors, and military families across the country. The initiative focused on 2 core missions supporting minority service members facing discrimination or systemic barriers, and protecting whistleblowers within federal and military structures. No longer would a soldier be forced into silence. No longer would families have to choose between justice and survival. The initiative would fund legal teams, mental health services, secure communication networks, mentorship programs, and specialized training for officers who wished to lead with equity. Its first national conference drew thousands. At the podium stood Nadine, not in uniform, but in a simple dark blazer. Her voice rang across the auditorium with the same quiet intensity she had carried into every mission. Courtroom and battle zone. This is not just for my daughter, she told them. This is for your daughters and your sons, for every recruit too afraid to speak, for every officer whose excellence was mistaken for defiance. We are building a military worthy of the people who serve it. Applause thundered. But even then, she didn't linger in the spotlight. She stepped aside and gave the floor to the next generation young lieutenants, cadets. and veterans who had once served in silence and now found strength in the name of the woman who'd refused to be buried with her daughter. And yet, for all the ceremonies, reforms, and national reckoning, one moment still remained, one that Nadine had reserved until the world's attention had shifted elsewhere, until the crowds had dispersed and the cameras had lowered their gaze. It was a late Sunday afternoon at Arlington National Cemetery. The air smelled of cherry blossoms and cut grass. The sun dipped low behind rows of pristine white headstones, and there, amid the quiet dignity of hallowed ground, Nadine walked alone in her service uniform, her ribbons catching soft golden light. She approached Jada's grave, now marked by a polished white stone engraved with full honors, rank, and a quote her daughter once left scribbled in a notebook, "Speak even if your voice shakes." Around the grave stood families who had flown in from across the country, mothers and fathers, siblings, children too young to understand the fullness of what had happened, but old enough to sense they were in the presence of something sacred. These were the families Jada had once helped, fellow officers she had defended, whistleblowers whose evidence she had safeguarded, and those whose names might have joined hers on forgotten rosters of the fallen if not for her courage. They stood now not as mourners, but as witnesses to a legacy reborn. Nadine paused before the headstone. She unfolded a fresh American flag, one that had flown over the Pentagon just days earlier and had been sent to her by the Secretary of Defense himself, with precise movements born of decades in uniform. She placed it gently on her daughter's grave. Then, with a breath caught somewhere between heartbreak and pride, she raised her hand in solemn salute. She did not salute alone, one by one. The families around her followed. A ripple of hands lifted, some practiced, some trembling. Some held baby carriers. Others held old photographs of their own lost loved ones, but all stood united beneath the flag that had once failed them, now reclaimed by their resilience. And in that quiet moment, Nadine Clark saluted not just the memory of a daughter stolen too soon, but the enduring strength of a nation still trying, still struggling to become what it promised in its founding breath, a more perfect union. Behind her, the flag at Arlington's heart snapped in the breeze. Before her, the future waited one she had helped shape not with vengeance, but with vision. And, as she stood at attention, framed by sunlight and shadows, the world finally understood. This was not the end, this was the beginning of something better. The story of Vice Admiral Nadine Clark and her daughter, Lieutenant Jada Clark, is not just a tale of injustice overcome, it is a mirror held up to America, reflecting the painful truth of who we are and the courageous vision of who we still have the chance to become. From the desecration of a funeral to the exposure of a vast, racially motivated conspiracy, the Clark story lays bare the systemic rot that can thrive when silence is rewarded and power goes unchecked. But it also teaches us something more profound, that no system, no institution, no hidden network of corruption is immune to truth, especially when it is wielded by people with the courage to stand up, speak out, and refuse to be erased. Nadine didn't ask to be a symbol. She asked to bury her daughter with dignity. But when her grief collided with injustice, she made a choice that changed the nation, choosing to turn pain into purpose, fear into fuel, and sorrow into strategy. Her fight led not just to accountability, but to legislation, reform, and a new legacy for every service member who ever dared to question the system. For American citizens watching this, the lesson is clear. Democracy is not a passive inheritance. It is an active responsibility. Justice is not inevitable. It is built, brick by brick, testimony by testimony, with the voices of ordinary people who refuse to look away. So, what can you do first? Stay informed. The institutions that failed Nadine and Jada count on your apathy. Don't give them that power. Second, share stories like this one not just to honor those who fought, but to awaken those who still sleep. Talk about them. Post about them. Challenge disinformation when you see it. Finally, support those who continue the work through legislation, through community advocacy, and, yes, through platforms like this one. If you believe in shining light on injustice, if you want to be part of a movement that demands accountability from every level of power, then help us keep telling these stories. Hit that like button to show your support for those who risk everything to speak out. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of courage, resilience, and real change. And most importantly, share this video with your friends, your family, your networks, because the more people who know the truth, the harder it is for the truth to be buried again. Let Nadine Clark's journey be more than a headline. Let it be a wake-up call, a rallying cry, a reminder that justice, when pursued with clarity and courage, doesn't just mourn the past, it shapes the future. And the next time someone tells you that one person can't change the system, you tell them about an admiral, a daughter, a folded flag, and the legacy that refused to be silenced. The fight for justice belongs to all of us. Let's make sure it never stands alone.